This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
The Archives.
Episode 120. Could the euro be the world's reserve currency?
This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. Today, we look at the euro as a reserve currency. Now, look, we know Steve hates the euro because it has, in effect, subdued the value of the German currency and inflated the value of southern European currencies. So it's created this north-south divide in Europe. But what about the euro taking on the US dollar as the reserve currency of the world, or at least an alternative to the US dollar? We'll look at that today on the Debunking Economics Podcast. Now, earlier this year, just a few weeks ago, in fact, Jean Claude Juncker, President of the European Commission, indicated that he wanted the euro to be the reserve currency, rivaling the US dollar. So Europe paid for big imports like oil in euros, not in US dollars. Now, Steve, we've spoken about Keynes's idea of creating the Bancor as the world's reserve currency. So no doubt we'll look at that in the next half hour. But first of all, what does a reserve currency actually mean, and why has the US dollar become it?
No, it goes back to, if you look at the pre-war days, pre-Second World War, when England was still the dominant colonial power, not necessarily the dominant economy, the dominant colonial power, and certainly in the 19th century that was the case. Most trade was transacted between countries in either gold or pounds. Yeah. And if you issued bonds for international trade, you're issuing those in pounds. We go through the Second World War, of course, UK comes out as one of the winners, but its economy is devastated, and America is by far the dominant economy of the world. So we had to reorganize the system after the war. A large part of the pre-war system was the gold standard. So the pound was denominated in a certain amount of gold, and there were periods during wars they would break away from the gold standard. There was a huge slump in the UK when Churchill, I think it was, insisted that England go back onto the gold standard at the same ratio that applied before the war. That caused massive collapse in the economy, about 20% fall in GDP in the early 1920s. So in and out of the gold standard. Keynes was a rampant critic of the gold standard, saying money is not a commodity. We shouldn't be basing it on a commodity. We should be using money as a tool for harnessing and creating physical resources. So his proposal was what he called a Bancor, and the Bancor was to be a currency issued by what we've now called the International Monetary Fund. He called it the International Clearing Union, and that would be proportional to the size of the economy. So if you imagine the US economy is, say, 10 times the size of the UK, it would get 10 times as many Bancor. And then to exchange goods between the UK and America, an American company wanting to buy UK products would have to convert through the International Clearing Union, convert dollars into Bancor, send the Bancor to the account of the UK part of the clearinghouse. That would then be converted from from Bancor into UK pounds for the company selling the product to the Americans. So you'd be passing through. The intermediate step would be through a common currency called a Bancor rather than passing through individual currency.
With fluctuating exchange rates still, though?
Actually with fixed exchange rates, but with rules about how they can be changed. So if you go back to the Bretton Woods Agreement, we got everything except the Bancor out of that proposal.
So Bretton Woods, yeah, that's right. Well, but when it was introduced, the Bretton Woods Agreement was that, the US dollar would be fixed to gold, wasn't it? Still, it was still set to the gold standard initially.
It was two things. Harry Dexter White, who was the chief of the American delegation, refused Keynes's idea of using a Bancor, insisted upon the American dollar. And I'm sure there's nothing in Keynes's proposal to fit the value of the Bancor to gold. Yeah. That would have been Dexter White as well.
But the US dollar initially at Bretton Woods, the US dollar was fixed to gold and at
$35 an ounce. Yeah.
Right. And then there was a fixed exchange rate to the US dollar. So in effect, everyone was still attached to, I think it was Nixon, wasn't it, who then pulled that apart and got rid of that
yeah. So what Keynes is trying to do is to get a monetary system not fixed to a commodity. Yeah. Which was set up deliberately to try to limit the level of both trade surpluses and trade deficits. And what we got instead was a US dollar allegedly fixed to gold, but we saw the direction of causation. The American economy ran a deficit. That should mean it starts running out of gold. Now, the fall down point there was that, in fact, when this was happening early on, America's running a trade surplus. Very rapidly over time, it became a trade deficit, which was financing by issuing US dollars. They were accumulating in the country, the treasuries of countries running surpluses, which included France. And at one point, de Gaulle, then France's leader, threatened, he was actually going to do it, threatened to deliver all the surplus American dollars that France had accumulated to buy gold from Fort Knox at $35 an ounce, and the amount of money that France had at that stage would have emptied Fort Knox.
Wow.
So that was the beginning, was one of several factors that led to Nixon abrogating the gold standard, and we ended up breaking that particular part of the camel designed by a committee, the horse designed by a committee, which is a camel, that we called our international monetary system after the Second World War.
But isn't it curious that that would happen? Because you would have thought there's nothing going to focus the mind more than the war, and, where you're trying to build, for example, Britain, doesn't want to lose. It needs to build more weapons, needs money to build those weapons, and money is constrained by gold. I mean, you'd say, well, this is just a crazy notion. We just need to build the stuff. We've got the resources. Let's do it. The idea that you have money constraining your ability to build stuff. So you would have thought that after the war, everyone would be going, well, clearly gold was a stupid idea.
Yeah, but unfortunately, we continue coming back to this mythology that the money has always been gold, when in fact money has always been a form of credit. And gold was an attempt to limit that credit creation, and was mainly used in international exchanges. Nobody used gold internally to go and buy your morning newspaper, but it was used between countries to settle transactions in the pre-war period. And we keep on returning to what Keynes called this barbarous relic.
So why? I understand why people would say, well, okay, let's use the US dollar as the reserve because it's the strongest currency right now. And I guess strength and stability is what you want. If you're not going to create your own new reserve currency, like the Bancor, then you want to look and see, okay, where is there strength and stability and volume? I guess they're the requirements, aren't they? We need something that there's a lot of, that's used a lot, domestically as well as internationally, and isn't subject to wild fluctuations. Its economy isn't subject to wild fluctuations. So maybe that's why the US dollar. But I don't understand. That makes sense. Perhaps it's back in 1944, but I don't understand why it's stuck with the US dollar since. Why, for example, does China own so much US debt? They've got a large proportion of all US treasuries have been bought by China. And we know that because they've been threatening to sell them. I'm not really quite sure why they would do that. We can come to that in a second. But why, for example, is the dollar still so seen as, the only game in town when it comes to the reserve currency?
Well, it comes down to the monetary system is designed around it. So if you want to use the SWIFT system, you've got to go through US dollars. And that's why, the blockage of Iran can be so effective, because the Americans can say, we've got the control over, it's our currency used for the SWIFT. Any company that trades with Iran, we will ban using SWIFT, and suddenly you're blackmailed by the Americans into supporting their policy on Iran, which is stupid, as everybody except the Americans knows. So it becomes a form of political power, and this is why Juncker is now saying, one of the few things I've ever agreed with Juncker in. Was it Juncker or? Yeah,
it was Juncker who was saying, he wants to.
Juncker. Okay, create another reserve currency, which at least it's the whole idea of a reserve currency is actually destructive for the country that becomes a reserve currency. And this is what we've seen with the British, and we've seen it with the American dollar as well.
Because it inflates the dollar too much.
It inflates the value. And I just casually remark and say it must be at least 30% overvalued. I've recently seen a study saying the American dollar is about 100% overvalued. So it should be it should be worth 50 cents right now rather than the nominal $1 value, because that's the extent to which it's overvalued, because everybody needs to hold the dollar to be part of international exchange. Now, if you didn't have that, we'd have a very, very, if we'd started with the Bancor, we'd have a totally different world to where we are now. Okay? Well, but what you would have is the American manufacturing would not be handicapped by having a dollar worth twice as much as it should be.
They could export more.
We'd have a strong American manufacturing sector.
Yeah, which obviously, I mean, they have a huge and growing deficit in the United States, but they do have one over everybody. So I mentioned, China owning so much debt. They've got this large proportion of US treasuries. China's been saying, well, if this trade war continues, we're going to sell them. But they wouldn't. I mean, would they? Because, if they started to sell them, then they'd go down in value and China would suddenly find that they're worse off as a result of it. This is one of
in fact, the Federal Reserve could buy them all. I mean, this is the thing. When you have when a domestic currency, is, created by the central bank of that country, which of course Europeans can't do, but Americans can, there's no limit to their capacity to buy anything that's denominated for sale in that currency. So it's not a weapon. And what you've got is the reason that China's doing that is not because they're trying to get power over America. They're trying to stop their trade surplus increasing the value of their own currency. And one way to do that is when you sell goods for American dollars, buy American bonds with them, don't convert them into domestic currency. Right. So it's insulating themselves from the impact of their own trade surplus. That's what they're doing it for.
I guess it's sort of hedging as well, isn't it? Their currency against the Chinese yuan. So, if the US dollar is getting stronger than their own currency, they're in effect playing the currency markets.
Yeah, fundamentally. And then that's the currency markets are played by all these central banks. So we have a mess of a system fundamentally. And I would love to see us go back to what we should have done in the first place, which is the Bancor. Yeah. But if we can't do that, I'd rather have more than one international currency as a reserve currency. So on that front, I think Juncker's idea is a good one.
Well, look at how that's practically going to work in just a second. But I mean, one of the other problems we've got right now, is that because the US dollar is getting so strong, everyone's paying for it, in particular, emerging markets where they have had to buy and are still having to buy stuff in US dollars because nobody's going to trade in their currency. And that means as the US dollar rises, everything's getting more expensive for them and therefore their economies are crumbling.
And you've also got that effect with they've got to issue debt in American dollars, and the American dollar's rising and their currency is falling. It becomes an impossible burden, which leads to default.
Yeah.
So yeah. We do need something. So, I mean, Juncker's ambitions is partly political. He wants to use this as a way of strengthening the euro. I think the euro should fail. It's my overpercent. It is a failure. The idea of using it externally is a good thing. The fact that it's used internally is a bad thing. I'd rather see it converted back to being just a form of international currency. Maybe in a funny sort of way, this might enable that as a possible bridge, because you could reintroduce national currencies beneath the euro, and use the euro for
like the
inter-country trade within Europe, and then spread from there to the stage where it's used globally.
Which is what we had with the ACU. Before we had the euro, we had the ACU. So everyone kept their own currencies in the ACU. So the ACU becomes the reserve currency and everyone sticks with their own currency. That would work. But how does that work alongside can you have two reserve currencies, global reserve currencies? And well,
you certainly could, because you then have SWIFT and SWIFT EU, for example.
Right.
Or SWIFT Euro. And therefore, if you wanted to make a transaction to buy goods off an Iranian company, rather than having to use the American dollar and then alerting the American Treasury and the American CIA to what you're doing, and being stopped from doing it, because they won't let American companies trade with you, go through the euro, have an alternative channel, and anything. I mean, this is one thing you can say in favor of Trump. Every possible abuse of your American power that could happen, bar one, has happened so far. And with that situation, anything to get away from this.
What's the one he's barring? Well, send off a nuclear missile.
No part of the world is glowing in the dark as yet.
So far, we're getting close to it. So
I'm not going to stick my neck out and say it won't happen.
So let's call it the ECU then, rather than the euro, because I know you are so against that for reasons that we've talked about at length. But basically, it's because it breeds indifference. It breeds differences in economies, and it helps Northern Europe and is detrimental to the South. But if we had the ECU as a trading currency, and that was the reserve, so that would be how would that be set? Would that be, does it float? Does it float in relation to all the other European currencies? Explain how it will work in principle.
It would have to float, and would be floating against the American dollar as well. And what I expect would happen is once you actually had a rival reserve currency, a global reserve currency, and it was something where you had the option of going one way or the other, I expect you'd see that currency would rise and the American dollar would fall. And interestingly enough, that would correct some of the hassles that Trump has about the trade imbalances, because it would make German goods more expensive and American ones cheaper. So,
and the ECU would be set the exchange rate between the ECU and European currencies. I guess it would be set by a basket of European currencies.
Yeah, and this is Keynes's idea about the bank call could be reproduced at the European scale. So Keynes was going to have, and this is vitally necessary because the trade deficits and surpluses within the European Union are a major part of what's pulling it apart, and those trade deficits exist because of the euro being used across the entire economy, and a country running a low inflation rate like Germany gets an advantage every year of the gap between its inflation rate and the inflation rate of the other countries, which compounds. So in the case of Italy, German goods are now about 20 to 25% cheaper than they were when the euro was formed, which is why Italian industry is falling apart. What you'd go to is the objective of the Bancor was to limit trade surpluses and trade deficits to 1% of GDP. Now, Germany is running a trade surplus of about 10%, maybe it's about 8.5%, 9% right now. I'm not sure what Italy's deficit is. It wouldn't be quite as bad because it trades with the rest of the world, but it would be running a deficit. So what you'd be doing is trying to narrow those deliberately, because we've seen that certainly hasn't been done by the market. Japan has maintained trade surpluses for at least 30, 40 years. Germany had a period of deficits back when it was doing the unification of East Germany with West Germany, but it's generally run surpluses as well. China's run almost indefinite surpluses. So our current system is not getting rid of these imbalances, whereas you could do that if you redesigned the euro as the ECU. You could do that and make that an objective, and that would potentially make the European Union more sustainable.
But of course, Juncker isn't thinking like that. Juncker is seeing it as an opportunity to strengthen the euro. But I mean, if it's pushed the value up of the US dollar, wouldn't it also push up the value of the ECU, which would be not good for Southern Europe?
Depending if
not the ECU, so the euro. I mean, it would be bad for Southern Europe, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and this is one of the dangers. But the thing is, the more reserve currencies there are, the closer you get to the situation where there is no reserve currency. If reserve currency means you've got to have a particular country's dollars, the currency in your reserve accounts to be able to trade. Well, if it's became the whole lot, you would no longer have a single reserve currency, and the euro becoming one along with the dollar, that's one step in that direction. But we certainly have a dysfunctional system, and this sort of sign when a country like the region like the euro region comes out with a proposal like this, it shows just how dysfunctional the current system has to be.
I'm sure Monsieur Juncker hasn't given it an enormous amount of thought, but he's just thrown the idea out there. But we've got European airlines buying European-made planes in US dollars. I mean, it doesn't make a great deal of sense, does it?
No, and it does make sense. It would have made sense to use Bancor to coordinate production across national boundaries, but the US dollar strengthens the US dollar at the expense of US manufacturing. So Juncker's proposal will actually weaken the euro in that sense, because it would make the euro more expensive and therefore make European goods denominated in euros more expensive. So it's one of these, there's no clean way out of this mess we're in at the moment. I would love to go back to, when it's something that people think the Second World War's just happened, let's go and design a new system. That's about the only sustainable way to get there. And we lost that opportunity courtesy of Harry Dexter White.
Yeah. And I take your point as well that, if you've got too many reserve currencies, they just become other currencies, don't they? So it's sort of like,
right.
But if you had two, then, in times of unrest, what does everyone buy? Do they buy the ECU or do they buy the US dollar? It would be interesting to see how that changed over time. And geopolitics would almost certainly have a part of that, but it would also limit the ability of someone like Trump to play that geopolitics card and use the reserve currency to his advantage, because people could just use option two.
I mean, the obvious cases, the Saudis would continue dominating their oil in dollars, and the Iranians would dominate their oil in euros.
Problem solved.
You'd have people, you'd be all sorts of arbitrage operations opening up. There were speculators that have a field day out of the two, but you'd have a way of monetary way of sidestepping the geopolitics of America having the dominant reserve currency on the planet.
Yeah, because the EU pays more than 80% of the energy imports into Europe are paid for in US dollars. And yet only 2% of the imports come from the United States. So yeah, it is a crazy situation. So what would it mean to America though? If the US dollar wasn't the reserve currency, say the ECU was established, and I know we are in fantasy land here because we've got to get rid of the euro for all of this to happen. But what would happen to the US dollar? It would go down in value. They would have less politics to play. But it would be good for America, ultimately, we seem to be saying.
It'd be good for the industrial sector of America, bad for the financial sector. The major thing that this did, having the US dollar as the reserve currency, is it gave enormous power to US financial corporations. Because you didn't have to raise American dollars. Your reserves are American dollars, which is a huge advantage over any other financial institution. So it's why we're not the only reason, but it's a major reason why we're dominated by US financial corporations. And why hasn't that worked out well for the rest of the planet?
Cryptocurrency fanatics would, of course, say, well, surely a cryptocurrency could become the default trading currency.
Well, there are ideas that you can actually use some of the cryptocurrency technology, but not the remaining idea of, I mean, if we went from Bitcoin as a fringe activity as it is right now to using the same sort of idea, the distributed ledger, we'd be using 100% of the planet's energy to finance transactions and getting no transactions out of it. So, it's a bit of an operational problem there with the multiple ledgers operating between central banks that they can all, there's authorized bodies, they can all see what the transactions are. Then yes, the distributed ledger technology within the limits of central banks could work quite well.
So the IMF has what are called SDR, special drawing rights, which is a bit like a reserve currency, isn't it? It's based on the basket of 5 currencies: the US dollar, the euro, the renminbi, the Japanese yen, and the pound. I mean, if that took off, that would in effect be a reserve currency. I mean, it reduces was that the idea behind it? Yeah.
That's the SDR is the watered down version of the Bancor.
Right.
So Keynes couldn't get the Bancor through, but when the IMF was formed, then it used special drawing rights as a way of a form of international exchange. It didn't take off, but it is a form of.
So why didn't it take off? Because the dollar was
the US is so dominant, and just that's the system he went with. You go through the American exchanges, the American private corporations, and systems like SWIFT, rather than going through the IMF. Right. Of course, the IMF got involved with all its wonderful economic policies designed to make economies prosper by turning them to third world countries. So the IMF didn't do all that well out of its SDRs.
Right. Okay. Because, I mean, there's one thing having it, there's the other applying it, and I guess that's it. Maybe it's too political for the IMF to start saying, well, let's use special drawing rights now as the reserve currency and let's put all the technology that needs to sit behind it, because America would just see that as a challenge and they'd piss off the IMF pretty quickly.
Which indeed they did do. So, here SDRs is just a very much watered down idea of the Bancor. And like, the amount you get issued proportional to your economy size, that was part of the Bancor idea, but it never became the form of international exchange.
Could it gain momentum though? Whether it is something like the SDR, I mean, would the IMF be the right body to push this forward if it wasn't the EU? Who would do it is the question I'm asking.
Given the damage the IMF has done globally, it'd again be attempting to impose some sort of restriction on they'd have somewhere they'd try to stop governments running trade deficits, budget deficits, I'm almost certain. But a large part of Keynes's idea for the Bancor was very mechanical. Once it was set up, there were a whole set of rules which my new doctoral friend, Dr. Trond Andresen in Norway, there was a PhD I went to last week, proposed that the Bancor could actually be described as a control system. And in that sense, it's something which there were feedbacks that were set on various things like whether you're running a trade deficit or a surplus, therefore taxes you were required to pay back to it, which then were automatically distributed out of the buffer to third world countries.
Right. But you can't set that up and leave that though. I mean, they are policy decisions that people nobody would agree saying, let's set that up and leave it for eternity. There would need to be some sort of administrative body there that's reviewing those policy decisions, presumably. Yeah,
but if they were set up by Keynes, they wouldn't include the budget deficit fantasies that the IMF is currently dominated by. So in the sequential world in which we live, I'm not sure the IMF is the best organisation.
So who would do it?
That responsibility.
Who takes charge of this then?
Well, in the case of what Juncker is suggesting, it would be the European Commission or the European Central Bank, again caught with the same ideas, but if you design it simply as I was saying, rather than having to use the American dollar, you can use the ECU, then it doesn't quite have the same political restrictions on how many ECUs are issued. If you set up the rule saying it's issued proportional to the size of your economy, then nobody's going to turn that rule over time. It's a sensible rule.
But the ECU would be based on the basket of European currencies, and yet if it became the new world reserve currency, its value really would be derived based on, interactions worldwide. Would it make sense to have that basket? I mean, I'm just thinking if it becomes a reserve currency, doesn't it lose its geography?
Yeah, and that's true, and that's why the Bank had no geography. Bank was issued proportional to the global size of economies relative to the globe itself, and that was just an easy rule. And as the economy grew, you got more Bancor issued to you.
So what Juncker's asking for is a reserve currency, which is basically Europe challenging America. I mean, it's a political stance because he's not saying, look, we're going to generate something. I mean, he's arguing the case that this is crazy because we're buying stuff in Europe with US dollars and we want to stop that. But what he's really saying is, we want to set up the reserve currency for the world, which is a bit of a power play. Geographically, it's a world power play.
Yeah. And this is one of the things that start happening when an unsustainable system starts breaking down. So I hope it does happen, but it isn't going to end up with being what Keynes wanted in the first place after the history we've been through for the last 70 years now. But
if Europe was to do that, then Asia's going to say, well, hey, hang on a second, we can do the same thing. Let's set up one for our part of the world.
And that's one thing I know from reading some of the work of the ex-governor of the Central Bank of China. He was a major fan of the Bancor. So that could easily be, you'd have a Japanese stroke Chinese, stroke Thai, stroke Malaysian, stroke Korean concept as well. And then you'd have several, and then you'd have these competing different systems, which is getting close to the stage where there is no international reserve currency.
Which is a good thing or a bad thing?
I think it's a good thing. Rather than having Americans being in control and the disaster that's created both for the American manufacturing sector and the global economy, particularly the American politics, the more alternative methods we have that don't go through the American dollar, the better. Right.
So we almost have a two-tier currency system then, don't we? The sort of like trade is happening in Asia, just as the ECU, was happening in Europe, but you're keeping your own currencies. That top level currency is seen as one of the world's reserve currencies, so people are buying it or selling it for transactions based on its stability. The only one who doesn't have a two-tier system in that arrangement is the United States. And so everybody suffers if the US dollar is strong or weak whereas everyone else is protected in a way because they've also got their own local currencies.
Yeah, so it could work. It could work as a way of getting out of the mess we're in right now. So that's the reason I hope Juncker's proposal goes ahead, and I hope the Asian central banks come up with something much the same, and we end up with three systems, which of course the Americans can't dominate all three. And the more the Americans try to dominate, as they are doing over Iran right now, the less transactions would occur through their system because people simply want to bypass that level of political control.
Well, another term of Donald Trump, and this becomes a more real possibility, doesn't it? The appetite for this sort of thing is going to grow.
Yeah, I think we've still got, how much longer we got of him at the moment? We've still got him still
got a couple of years to go, yeah.
2020, from February 2021, if he loses the next election, and if he does hand over power, that's when he'd do it. So we've still got, 1.5 years worth of this, actually 2 years of this to go. 1990.
We've got 2 years, and then we've got another term if he gets in as well, which is
2019, 2020. So that's enough time for this sort of thing to be developed.
Yeah, well, let's hope Mr. Juncker wasn't using this just as as a brain fart, and he actually gives some attention to it and tries to push it forward. For once, there might be something that we agree with him on. Good to talk, Steve. We'll catch you again very soon.
Okay, mate, that's good.
In fact, it makes you wonder, doesn't it, whether there's an opportunity here to form some sort of agreement with Europe over Brexit, if this is what the aim is of the European Union, given that there are, on the day that we are publishing this podcast, thousands of people marching in London asking for another vote. Well, maybe the vote should be choose between these two. Number one, Britain remains in the EU, but the EU does accept that the euro has actually been the cause of the displacement of people in within the European Union, and that's what really caused the Brexit vote in the first place. So the easiest way of solving that problem is abolish the euro. And if you want a global or a Europe-wide currency, revert to the former ECU, the European Currency Unit, as a trading currency, and then help to establish that as a global reserve currency. So Europe really is challenging the dominance of the United States with Britain in it. That's option one. I know it might be a bit difficult to fit that on the ballot sheet. And then obviously option two is we leave. And then we'd have to have another vote as to what form that lead. Or, is it a choice between whatever botched deal Theresa May comes up with, or crashing out on World Trade Organization rules and having to build a brick wall on the Irish border and probably losing Scotland from the United Kingdom. There I am, scaremongering again. Take your pick on that one. Look, next time, but by the way, I disagree with Steve Keen on the whole Brexit thing. That's one thing we do come to loggerheads on, so we try not to talk about it too much. But he's gone now. Next time, John McDonnell, the Shadow Chancellor, wants companies of a certain size with 250 or more people in it to set up ownership funds, shared ownership funds, so people working in the company basically have a shareholding in the company. That's what he's saying they'll do if Labour ever gets into power. We'll look at that next time on the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. Thanks for listening.